Okay, this video is called The Art of the Ancient Greeks, and the reason I'm making it at this time is because, we're right in the lead up to Easter. Easter is March 31st, 2024, and the ancient Greeks are really a major part of the beginning of Christianity. And the ancient Greeks are one of my favorite things to study about. They were fascinating, interesting, and they were most of the ancient world since the beginning of recorded time has been sort of brutal, tyrannical, dictatorial, non-free, whereas the ancient Greeks really promoted the idea of, free speech, especially amongst, of course, the aristocrats. But it was the best thing going on in the world at that time, and it led to so many good things. This picture right here is the allegory of the cave by Plato, the greatest philosophical allegory ever made. And the gist of it is that most of the people, the proles, if you will, are deceived by illusions. And the storytellers, so to speak, put forth illusions, the shadows on the cave wall, and they never know any better. And the idea was that to be an enlightened philosopher, one must climb out of the cave and see things objectively by the light of the sun, what is real truth rather than manufactured truth, manufactured consent, if you will. And Plato really saw Socrates as the great leader of men into the light of truth. And a big part of what this was about was the idea that Socrates was a new type of hero. Plato had been a frustrated playwright, a frustrated politician, but he later was able to combine his skills into becoming a great philosophical writer, the greatest ever. And he wrote his philosophical dialogues like Plato's Republic in the form of a play, different characters speaking their parts. And Socrates was like the superhero, intellectual superhero, and he created something new in literature and in the Greek mind. Before that, the classic hero was, for example, Achilles, a brave warrior, kind of brutal. All right, and then along came Odysseus. And Odysseus was a more interesting hero. He was more clever. We're going to talk about him some more as we go on with the pictures in this painting. But Socrates was an intellectual hero, the hero of philosophy, the saint of philosophy. And it was a new way of seeing things. So we'll go through all of that. Now, Diogenes, he was the street homeless philosopher, and he used to like to make fun of Plato. So Plato was here giving a lecture to his students at the academy, and he's telling them a definition of a man was a featherless biped. And so Diogenes plucked a chicken and said, look, here's Plato's idea of a man. All right, we're going to come back to Diogenes. Now, here is the painting. And by the way, all these paintings were made by, Christians that I'm aware of. And they're magnificent. So this comes from the Renaissance, from Botticelli. Botticelli and Rogier van der Weyden were the two greatest artists of the 1400s. And this is magnificent. The Greek mythology and literature that goes around it, it's magnificent. It's great. It's beyond good. This is the birth of Venus, and obviously it's a magnificent, beautiful picture. And I used to have my before and after pictures of a woman losing weight, then being like Venus, and a whole bunch of things come from that. Okay, here's another painting by Botticelli, Primavera, the spring. And the Greeks, other than Plato, as Schopenhauer had said it, the Greeks really had a great sense of enjoying life and getting the most out of life, other than Plato. And we're going to get into that because the big separation in Greek philosophy is between the ideas of Plato versus the ideas of Aristotle. Okay? So, this is joyous and fun and happy, and that's how it should be. Now, some of the other forerunners of modern thought and Christian thought are these plays here, like, for example, Antigone. So Antigone was the daughter of Oedipus. He's the guy who inadvertently ended up in the sack with his mother. He didn't realize it. And she is the daughter of Oedipus, the sister of Eteocles and Polynices. So there was a bit of a dispute over who was going to be the new ruler, and they fought, okay? And Polynices sort of fought against the king of the time now, Creon, and then Eteocles was successful. Eteocles is the brother of Antigone. But the point of the matter is, the king said that Polynices should not have a burial. He should be left out and eaten by the dogs and the vultures. Okay, Antigone refused to go along with that and tried to bury her brother, so she was arrested in Thebes and sentenced to death. Okay, King Creon's son was in love with her, and it created a disaster. So one of the big points of Antigone are, first of all, Antigone was asked, why did she disobey the king? And she said, because there are laws of heaven that are not of today, nor of yesterday, but for all time, and they are above the laws of man. So that's an important thing and an important prelude to Christian thought. Basically, what God says is more important than what any ruler says, and people should be aware of that because it creates a much better society. Okay? And it just created a big disaster. So kind of the big point of this too is people should learn to forgive and be nice, okay, because everyone would have been better off. So King Creon's son was in love with Antigone, and when she was sentenced to death, he himself committed suicide. She hung herself in prison, and then Creon, the king's wife, was so pissed off, she committed suicide too. So the whole thing was a big disaster, and it all could have been averted instead of going tit for tat if they had just, been a little bit more forgiving. Antigone meant well. She was trying to, do right by her brother. That's a fundamental right of Christianity, is to bury the dead. Okay, so the ripple effect means, you're nice to the people around you, they're nice to the people around them. All of a sudden, everybody's nice to each other, and you have a good society. Okay, so this is a great heroine, Antigone, of doing the right thing, even when it's not what the ruler wants you to do. This was just some stuff. We're not going to get into all this slide, okay. All right, now here's another famous story from the plays of the ancient Greek tragedies. They're magnificent. Okay, so one of them is the story of Agamemnon. He took a mistress, Clytemnestra. She had a lover while he was gone in the Battle of Troy. And when she came home, she killed Agamemnon, or her lover did. And then what had happened was the son of Agamemnon and her son avenged the father by killing Clytemnestra. So I know it's a whole big mess. And then she called upon the Furies to avenge her, okay? And this is getting somewhere. I know it sounds a little bit involved, but it's going to get somewhere. So here was the son, Orestes. That was Clytemnestra. And these are the Furies that have been, summoned against him. All right, so the reason I went through all this is that originally they had a trial, and it was in the Areopagus, and Athena was there as well. So Athena is the goddess of Athens. And what came out of it was, you could have these feuds going back and forth like the Hatfields and McCoys, and they can go on for hundreds of years. And so finally Athena just, they had it discussed in front of, the other judges at the Areopagus, but they acquitted Orestes. And this is very important and symbolic because it was an example of forgiveness on a grand scale, and that's a prelude. If you look historically, the big thing noticed about Jesus, what did he add that tremendously changed societal approach, was the idea more of forgiveness. Love thy neighbor, sometimes turn the other cheek, sometimes just let things go and forgive people. And that's a big thing in society, and that comes up a lot. If you read Hannah Arendt, she's a real smart lady who wrote a history of communism, okay? And she said the greatest thing that Jesus Christ brought that was new since a lot of the ideas of the Old Testament, for example, was the importance of forgiveness in human relationships. So I think that's a great thing. And what I'm also saying, though, this is a prelude to it in a big way, Orestes. There's really good, the plays are just fantastic. The whole story is great. And that's also been said. If you read Quo Vadis, a magnificent book, or just watch the movie, it talks about how the Romans were so brutal and evil and unforgiving. So I'm going to get into the paths of thought, but basically this is Plato. This is the painting School of Athens, which is magnificent. The best book ever written about philosophy, by the way, is called The Cave and the Light, especially about Plato and Aristotle and their influence on society ever since their time. It's by Arthur Herman. It's an awesome, great book. If you only read one book about philosophy, that's the one to read. Okay, I've read tons of them. Okay, so here are some quotes by Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand is the smartest woman who ever lived. And she basically said Aristotle is the greatest philosopher who ever lived, and in her opinion, he set the tone for hope for mankind. She said, if there is a philosophical atlas who carries the whole of Western civilizations on his shoulders, it is Aristotle. Whatever intellectual progress men have achieved rests on his achievements. Aristotle may be regarded as the cultural barometer of Western history. Whenever his influence dominated the scene, it paved the way for one of history's brilliant eras. Whenever it fell, so did mankind. Aristotle is the father of individualism. So that's a big sentence right there. Aristotle is the father of individualism. So this is Aristotle right here. He came from a background in biology. His father's a doctor. He's pointing down to the ground saying, let us study the things of this earth and try to make sense of them in an objective way. Plato is pointing upward with the idea of pointing into the skies and his theory of the perfect forms. You know, you're looking at a chair, but it's not the essential form of a chair. That is in the heavens, and we have them in our minds. So Plato was a lot of a mystic. And the other thing that annoys people about Plato is, you know, he was living through the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And Sparta conquered Athens, and it was a very humiliating defeat. And it made Plato more sympathetic to Sparta's ways of viewing things. Sparta was a brutal place, forced all the men into the service, and it was a very sort of violent, primitive, backward, and stupid. So here he is, Mr. Philosopher, reading and studying all the time, but he thinks that society should be kind of communistic, okay? It's a collectivist society. People have very little freedom. The families are not very tight-knit or well, not like we would envision our modern family is that much. So anyways, Plato leads down the path, we're going to talk about this, to the Augustinian view of Christianity. And Nietzsche has said Christianity is largely Platonism for the masses, okay? And some people believe that that leads to collectivism and socialism and the Protestant church way of looking at things. And the other view is that Aristotle sort of led to, you know, individual freedom, and also leads to Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism, like in the 1200s, 1300s, and that movement, which is thought to have led to the Renaissance. And so that has led more of a path down Catholicism. Okay, Catholicism really has a lot more appreciation and celebration of the ancient Greeks, and a celebration of art and sculpture and architecture, and it's more fun. Okay, Protestantism, you know, coming out of Martin Luther and the Reformation, was more like all we care about is the Bible, the literature. They would get rid of all the sculptures in the churches and the paintings in the churches, whereas Catholicism has loved art from the beginning, paintings, sculptures, cathedrals, stained glass windows, all that stuff. Okay, so this magnificent painting basically is mostly Greek philosophers and scholars in the background of Roman-like architecture. Okay, and this is in the stanza signature, or the signature room of the Vatican in Rome, and it was painted by Raphael in 1511. Okay, there's Michelangelo. Raphael admired Michelangelo so much when he saw the Sistine Chapel that he painted him into the picture. Okay, there's Diogenes, the homeless philosopher, sitting on the stairs right there. This is Socrates arguing with Alcibiades and some other people. So it's magnificent. This is one of the greatest paintings of all time. It summarizes so much of what is good of history. So it's a lot of fun to study the history of the arts and philosophy and culture, because we see mankind moving up, getting better, versus when you study regular history, it's just brutal. It's like one tyrant after another. Okay, in 399 BC, Socrates was forced to drink the hemlock. And this is Plato, who's very sad about it, because he basically said, what kind of a city is Athens that it would persecute and condemn to death the greatest man in the whole city, Socrates, okay? This painting is by Jacques-Louis David, 1787, the French artist, and it's a magnificently sad painting. And Socrates said a lot of good common sense things. Here's like typical Socrates. The purpose of philosophy is to determine how we ought to live. And in order to decide how to live well, we should try to learn what is good for us and what is bad for us, and do what is good for us and avoid what is bad for us. There's pretty good common sense. And it had been said of Socrates that he sort of brought philosophy down to the world in a way that all people could appreciate. And a lot of good stuff does come from Socrates, okay? Sometimes he's a little bit of a hypocrite. You know, he accuses the the people he's debating against of being sophist, and he can be a little sophist in his own. But Socrates was very great, and he does deserve to be sort of like the hero of philosophy's origins, and as he's been described as a saint of philosophy. Okay, now this is St. Augustine, who was trained as a rhetorician, around 300 AD is when he lived. And he was trained as a rhetorician, he was a big scholar of Cicero, for example. And he sort of took on a lot of Plato's ideas. And that's what I mean by that's the Platonic, from Plato, strain of thought in Christianity. Okay? And Augustine did some good things, but he was also kind of a pain in the butt with all this predestination stuff, and he's so obsessive. Okay, here's a painting of Aristotle. And the more you learn about Aristotle, you just love the guy. He was the greatest, okay? He basically tried to summarize all the knowledge of his time and to make life better for people. And he wrote on all kinds of things. And we lost lots of his writing. And unfortunately, he didn't write his own books. A lot of what we have written on Aristotle's ideas comes from the notes of his students. So they're a little bit, all over the place and stuff, but there's still a ton of wisdom in there. Basically, the academic systems were shaped by his thought for, the next over 1,500 years. All right, so his theories of speech, his theories of literature, they're fantastic. And I mean, one of the great things that he said, and Ayn Rand pointed this out, is he said that stories and poetry are more important than history, because history only tells you what was, but the stories and the poetry tell you what could be. They give you a role model mentor of what's possible in your mind's eye, so to speak. And they sort of help you to seek a path in the future towards the good. Okay, and he was very academic. I mean, he was trying to classify all the animal species of his time. Very, Alexander the Great, when he would go into new places to conquer them, they would send specimens of the animals of the area back to Aristotle to classify them. He was a biologist as much as a philosopher. Okay, and he was an expert on literature and stuff. Okay, so here's another guy that came along then who was very much influenced by Aristotle. This is St. Thomas Aquinas. And this is a famous painting where he had a vision of himself before Christ. And he's like, I've worked so hard and I feel like I haven't been able to do much. I wish I could have done more. And Christ said, no, you did good, Thomas. You're doing good. I appreciate you. And so what I'm saying is what Thomas Aquinas showed is that faith and reason, they're not in contrast to each other. They go together. They improve each other. There are obviously obvious differences between, objective science and reason and religious faith and all that. But the basic premises of religious faith in Christianity make people into better scientists. And I've talked about this plenty in my medical lectures. Without biblical Christian type ethics, you can't really even have science, okay? And I'll say that, not completely would I say that 100%, but what I've seen, I've been a doctor over 30 years, is as soon as you throw out biblical ethics, everything becomes about money. And what that means is a new drug, so what if it kills a bunch of people? As long as it makes money and they can get away with it, the big pharma will promote that drug. On the other hand, if they have biblical ethics, they would say, look, this is going to hurt more people than it's going to help. Therefore, we should not lie to the people and say it's a good drug, okay? They've got so much money, they can just pay and cover up all the complications and deaths, so they will do it to make their money. We talked about this in my other lectures, but that's why I think if you're going to have good health care, you have to have biblical ethics. You have to say the individual is more important than our profit in this situation. We're going to do what's right for this person, because otherwise you end up with a chaos, okay? And then sort of the Aristotelian, scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, Thomism version of Christianity is really sort of the main thread in Catholicism versus the Platonic Augustinian thread with a collectivist bent to it is more of the Protestantism, by the Bible only. And I find that a bit of a joke because the church was in existence for, hundreds of years before the Bible was sort of codified and agreed upon, okay? And what I'm sort of saying is a perfect example is Erasmus is characteristic of Catholicism. he loved to tell jokes and have fun and was pretty open-minded about a lot of things in comparison with Luther. Luther was kind of like my way or the highway, okay? Sola scriptura, only the Bible. Sola gratia, by faith alone is man saved, okay? All right. Erasmus, like, here's just a couple quotes of Erasmus. Well, in my opinion, the things Christians agree about, like Jesus Christo and the saints as role model, and be nice to each other, and make your life a source of goodness and light in the world, they're a billion times more important than all the petty things they disagree with. Okay, here's some quotes by Erasmus. Eagles do not chase flies. To interweave aphorisms is to make language sparkle with gems from antiquity. Your library is your paradise. By labeling the new learning as heresy, they make orthodoxy synonymous with ignorance. So Erasmus was a big scholar, and he was a lot of fun. Like a typical thing Erasmus did, he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly. You know, because you can kind of, you have to have a sense of humor in order to get through life and get along with people. You know, and that reminds me like the Ben Franklin quote about marriage. He said, before going into marriage, a man should have his eyes wide open. Once he's agreed to it, he probably should keep them half shut. And, you know, that kind of a sense of humor just makes things work out better between people. All right, now here is a painting of Deucalion holding his wife up from the flood. And the reason I show you this is there's a lot of correlation with the events of the early Bible, like in Genesis. There are flood stories throughout a bunch of other cultures, including the Greeks, of how mankind was largely wiped out by the flood. All right, so I show you that to realize there's a lot more useful accuracy in the Bible than is widely acknowledged. Okay, here's just a famous story of Demosthenes. As a young boy, you know, his parents died early and he kind of got ripped off of his inheritance, and he taught himself to be a good public speaker so that he could, you know, serve as his own lawyer and, you know, not get ripped off for his inheritance in court. And he sort of was like a role model. He would put pebbles in his mouth and try to speak over them. He would try to speak over the waves to be able to have an impressive presence. That was a very big thing for the ancient Greeks, you know, is to be a good public speaker, and for the Romans too. If you're interested in becoming a better public speaker, study Demosthenes, study Cicero. You'll be well worth your time in Aristotle. Okay, so here's the apotheosis of Homer. Again, the celebration of the bard. He was the blind bard. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Idiot and the Oddity. And those were great ancient books, and they were a little bit almost like a moral, behavioral guideline of the ancient cultures, okay? So the Iliad is more of just, you know, the war between the Greeks, so to speak, and Troy, where, you know, Paris had stolen Helen away from the king of Sparta. And then the Odyssey is more like a travel journey of Odysseus trying to find his way back home to Greece, to Ithaca. Okay, so here's the flowering of Greece, and you know the Greeks made lots of really beautiful buildings, and they have the Acropolis, the buildings up on a hill, and they were magnificent. When you study the Greeks, man, you can't help admiring them. And Schopenhauer is one of the greatest philosophical geniuses of all time. He just said, why were they so much smarter than us? Because you read the ancient Greeks, and you're like, holy shit. It's like one genius after another in Athens did so much great stuff. You know, there was also a flowering of geniuses in, you know, Renaissance Italy. And what I would say from studying that sort of thing, why do golden ages happen? And I think it happens because you have a society where people feel safe, people are relatively prosperous, they have enough money that they have leisure time, and then that they have some type of philosophy, metaphysic, that motivates them to try to do good things that benefit everyone and that are aesthetically beautiful and good. And you need to have that in a society. And that only happens rarely. Most societies are dominated by a tyrant who just brutalizes everybody and pushes them into slavery. That's been the vast majority of societies since the beginning of time. That's why the ancient Greeks were so unique. And the ancient Romans were nowhere near as good as the Greeks. I mean, their republic was actually a reasonable government for about 500 years, but then as they went into an empire, there were a lot of problems with that, and they're very tyrannical and corrupt. Okay, now here's a nice painting of the Acropolis, so a city on a hill, and that idea comes into Christian thought as well. You know, the idea of a light on a hill, a city on a hill, a beacon of goodness to shine to all mankind. There's a statue of Athena, the goddess of Athens. And, you know, it's beautiful, okay? It's just wonderful. And this was all happening in ancient Greek a long time ago, over 400 years before Jesus Christus. Okay, so here is Pericles, the leader of Athens, giving a funeral oration in front of the Acropolis, all the cities there on a hill. And so Pericles did some good things to build up Athens and make it more beautiful, but he was also, in my opinion, a bit of a jerk. He pushed and pushed for the war with Sparta, and he was so sure they were going to win, but then he died, and the subsequent leaders of Athens were less capable, plus they screwed over Alcibiades like they're one of their best leaders. That's a common thing in societies, is they get jealous of great men, and then they damage themselves, okay? Athens, okay, we're not going to get into all the history of ancient Greeks. I'm just sort of showing you these things here. Phidias was a great sculptor of Athens, and this is just, showing the sculptures in the wall to Aspasia, who was the girlfriend of Pericles, Alcibiades, and friends. So I'm just making the point, we don't really have a lot. We got some of their sculptures. We lost most of their paintings. They didn't save well. Luckily, we've got most of their books because our scholars kept them. Here's a beautiful painting called Lost Illusions by Charles Gleyre, and this is sort of the sadness of a man. He's the poet has dropped his lyre because his musical instrument is harp, because the ladies and the children are kind of going off away. And it sort of brings home to me the point that men love women, okay? If they talk about these dating sites, that the men will say that 85% of the women are attractive, and the women will say 85% of the men are ugly. And what I'm trying to say is, men and women, the other thing too, modern society tries to pretend that men and women are the same. That's not true. Anybody who's, lived with their family for a while knows their brothers and sisters, their mamas and papas are not the same. They got a lot in common, of course, but their differences all sort of complement each other. Aristotle had said the family is, God's invention for man to be happy. Okay, so anyways, the point of this is that man without women and kids, he's sad, he's lonely, okay? So even though we kind of complain that they make too much noise and it's hard for us to work and to study and to think, they bring a lot of joy and happiness and some great painting. Oh, college degree in 10 minutes on the ancient Greeks. All right, well, this is just some, if you want to read it, these are some of the great historic events, and you can learn a ton from studying the ancient Greeks. If I was like, let's say I cloned myself and I had to give my young self guidance, I would help my young self to avoid the public school system, and I would just homeschool them if I was like available and stuff. And one of the things I would do is have that kid study the ancient Greeks, learn the ancient Greek language and study the ancient Greeks. So much good stuff comes out of it. It's amazing. There were so many wonderful things about the ancient Greeks. All right, here is, the remnant of the Parthenon, one of their great buildings, and of course this led to more and more classical architecture, and we think of the famous, Roman building being the pantheon for all gods, pan meaning all, thea for gods, and that sort of led to American classical architecture. And then, of course, the greatest architecture of all time is Christian architecture with the cathedrals. That's objectively as good as it could possibly be. Okay, so after the fall of Troy, this was Aeneas, and he was like a young prince, and he basically carried his father out of ancient Troy. That's Anchises. His son also went with him, Ascanius. His wife died, and that's part of the story because he was to go on to found Rome. But one of the things this painting symbolizes the idea of there's ups and downs in life and difficult times, but one of the jobs of a young man is that he should carry the wisdom of his father into the future, and he should teach the younger people about what happened before them so that they will be able to have better societies and better lives. So here's another version of the painting, this one by Carl van Loo. Again, an Aeneas carrying his father Anchises out of burning Troy, and there's the son Ascanius following along. And so I'm basically trying to do the same thing. So here I am, trying to carry the wisdom of McDougall and the other nutrition greats onto future generations. And so I kind of joke that he says, "Put me down, you arrogant little upstart. I'll kick your ass. I'm the Fighting Irish." Well, no, sorry, John. We got to get moving here, and you're going a little slow. I think I got to carry you. All right, so here's a similar painting. This is the last day of Pompeii. So this is when Mount Vesuvius erupted over the city of Pompeii, a Roman city. And it reminded me almost of the same thing, because you can see there's the young man looking like Aeneas, and the son looking like Ascanius, carrying out the father looking like Anchises. So I couldn't help thinking of the two, and I'll bet you whoever thought of this had the same idea. Whoever made this was made later in the 1800s. But anyways, it's still a magnificent painting. Okay, and a lot of great just story models come out of ancient Greece. So this one is the lost city of Atlantis, and Plato wrote about this. And we can learn a lot from studying these civilizations, and you can also create a theoretical ideal utopia civilization. So that's part of what that story was about. The Greek myths, they're just wonderful. So here's the one about the fall of Icarus. So Icarus and his father Daedalus. Daedalus was an engineer. They made these wings to escape from the labyrinth, and their certain death, and they were going to fly home and be safe. But the young guy just got, a little bit too bold and overdid it and flew too close to the sun, and his wings melted. And he goes crashing down into the sea. And the point of this painting, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus by Bruegel, was that, life goes on and people just ignore it. So not a very encouraging painting, but it's still beautiful. And then the next one's a little more sympathetic. We've got the young Icarus here, and, the ladies of the lake, the sirens, whatever you want to call them, they're consoling him and mourning his premature death. Okay, it's called Lament for Icarus by Herbert James Draper is the name of the painter for this one. Okay, here's another Greek myth. And this one is Ariadne, daughter of the king of Minos on the island of Crete, giving Theseus a ball of yarn that he's going to use to find his way out of the maze, the labyrinth, after he fights the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull. Okay, and they fell in love. It's a long story. She ended up marrying Bacchus. We're not going to get into all that. I'm not going to go into too much on the myths. This is not about Greek literature. This is more about Greek art and how it's a prelude to Christianity. And a lot of these things are kind of funny. So here's Pandora opening the box, okay? So, of course, she was told not to open the box, which made her more curious, so she opened the box. And what came out of it, though, was all these problems. And so the reason why this is kind of funny is because it's a lot like the Bible, where it kind of blames things on Eve. This woman, she can't control herself, curiosity, and she does something stupid, causes all these problems for everybody. And so the ancient Greeks kind of had the same thing. Oh, it was Pandora's fault. But, of course, there's more to it than that. But it's a little bit funny that that's what they do. Okay. Zeus was pissed off that Prometheus had stolen fire and given it to man. So Zeus gave Pandora this mysterious box that was beautiful with high curiosity. And he gave it to the brother of Prometheus, who was named Epimetheus, or Afterthought. Okay, so anyways, that's the joke with that. The story of this Pygmalion and Galatea, the sculpture, and then he wishes the sculpture would come to life because he's fallen in love with her, and then eventually she does. And, this scientist, Gerald Pollack, he's the guy who figured out the fourth phase of water. He says, scientists love their models almost as much as artists do. Okay, and this is like the fantasy of the nutrition guy. He's lonely, and he's going to coach this fat girl into being healthy and thin and as beautiful as she can be. And as soon as she gets all beautiful, she tells him to take a hike. So it's the nutrition fantasy joke. Okay, here's Phryne at the Areopagus. And she was a lady who had gotten herself into trouble for blasphemy. And the judges at the Areopagus, that's the court of the ancient Greeks on the Acropolis, were going to judge her guilty. And her lawyer said, no, she's innocent. And he took her robe off, and the judges, she's so beautiful, they all felt sorry for her, and she was acquitted. That's sort of a famous story, and she became a goddess-like person in their society. Another just famous Greek myth, the bull is Zeus, and here he's abducting Europa, and that's a long story about the founding of Europe and everything. And it's just an example of a beautiful painting. Okay, so all kinds of stuff like this just comes out of Greek myths and Greek literature, and it's great. Oh, here's just another version of it, the abduction of Europa. And there's all these, angels around here. And what I'm saying is you see that Christian edge on things. But there's sort of this fun, celebratory just way it is, that life is beautiful and abundant and we can all be happy and have fun. That's a big thing in Greek culture. Let us speak freely, let us enjoy each other, let us enjoy life. The Greeks partly were thinking that way because they had a whole bunch of different islands and they traded with the different islands, so they're very open-minded to new ways of thinking and learning. And that's partly why they were so smart. Okay, this comes from the Iliad, and this is Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, and this was his best friend Patroclus. And Patroclus, going a little bit back to the early part of the stories, Achilles was pissed off at Agamemnon, the head general of the Greeks in the Trojan War, because Agamemnon had stolen his mistress. So he's like, you know what, screw you, I'm not going to fight, go fight this battle on your own. And he was sort of just brooding by himself. All right, and with Achilles out of the picture, the Greeks started to lose to Troy, and Hector was just kicking everybody's butt. Patroclus wanted to try to turn the morale around of the Greeks, so he took Achilles' armor and went out into the field. And then he fought Hector and was killed by Hector. Hector was the great leader fighter of the Trojans. And Achilles was so upset about the death of Patroclus, his best friend, that he just went into a rage, and that's what's called the wrath of Achilles. And this is sort of the heroic mindset of the ancient Greeks of that time. And he was victorious over Hector, and he actually dragged him behind his chariot. It was sort of a brutal, evil thing to do, but Achilles had lost control of himself and his temper, and he dragged him in front of the walls of Troy, and it was a very wrong, evil thing to do. And this is partly what Plato was talking about when Greek needed new types of hero rather than just, you need a warrior type in society, but you need more than that if you want to have a good society. And then this was the Trojan horse. This was Odysseus' idea as a way to get inside the walls of Troy. And the Greek soldiers were hiding inside of the Trojan horse. So it's the idea of bringing something in that seems like a gift, like a good thing, but actually there's a problem hiding in the belly of it, because at night the Greek soldiers came out and then they opened up the gates and they sacked Troy. Okay, so you'll hear that word Trojan horse a lot. That's where it comes from. And Odysseus is the one that figured it all out. Painting is by Tiepolo, the Trojan horse. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit more about Odysseus. So after the victory over Troy, and Achilles died, by the way, because his mother Thetis, who had dipped him into the river Styx, and every part except for his heel, she held him by the heel when she dipped him into the water, and that was the Achilles heel, and he got shot by an arrow there by Paris. So that's how Achilles died in the battle between the Greeks and Troy. Odysseus survived, and he later then, after the victory, wanted to get back home to Ithaca, to his wife Penelope, who he loved. And they had a bunch of adventures on the way, including fighting with the Cyclops, one-eyed monster. And this is when they're escaping in their boat. Okay. The one-eyed monster is called Polyphemus. And then they had to go through an area where there were the sirens, these women who were beautiful in one version of the story. In this one, they have them, looking like eagles, like harpies. But they had a very seductive song that would captivate any man. And so the Greek sailors, they had to cover up their ears so they wouldn't be seduced into mischief that was not in their best interest by the sirens. Okay, Odysseus wanted to hear what they had to say, but he knew he wouldn't be able to control himself, so he was tied to the mast. Okay, and the reason I'm showing you all this stuff is because once you study Greek culture and history, it's beautiful. You'll see so many literary allusions and metaphors that you still use in commonplace and that really capture human behavior in situations. Great. So here's another version of the sirens, looking more like beautiful women, perhaps half woman, half fish, like mermaids, if you will. And again, Achilles is tied to the mast. The sailors have their ears covered up. And it's kind of like brings back the joke. It's very difficult for a man, when he finds a woman attractive to, keep her in her place and not let her talk him into doing things he shouldn't do. Okay, Odysseus is trying to find his way home, and he goes into the underworld. And this is a common literary technique. It's called catabasis, whereby one goes into the underworld and is able to talk to the dead. So he wanted to talk to the philosopher Tiresias, talk to his parents, And I kind of joke that we can get a lot of wisdom from talking to the people who are dead. Read the history, read about Walter Kempner, read about Dennis Perkins if you want to learn about nutrition and health. These old guys had a lot of knowledge. All right, now here's Pythagoras. He was a brilliant Greek philosopher, mathematician, and he was a big proponent of the vegan diet. So people would describe a vegetarian diet before 1800. They'd call it a Pythagorean diet, okay? And he helped invent the original musical scale. And here's the Pythagoreans celebrating the sunrise. Sounds like pretty good health. Vegan diet, enjoying sunshine, enjoying music. Like I said, prototype preliminary Christians, all right? So it's a beautiful day, beautiful painting. And God's way of healing. It doesn't cost any money. You got to buy food anyways. Might as well eat the good food. Okay. All right. Another famous ancient Greek was Diogenes. And here's Diogenes walking through Athens with his lantern lit. And they said, well, what are you doing, Diogenes? He says, I'm trying to find one honest man. So Diogenes is a pretty funny guy. Very clever. And here's Diogenes. Like he's a homeless street philosopher living in his little giant urn here, so to speak. And this one, he's also got his lantern. This one is The Poor Man's Philosopher by Jean-Léon Gérôme. He made a lot of great paintings about, classical times, being the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. Oh, here's a famous story of Diogenes was seated by his little home there in the streets, and Alexander the Great came through Athens, and he had heard all these stories about Diogenes, so he wanted to meet him. And so he was the great, richest, most powerful man in the world. He said to Diogenes, is there anything I can do for you? If it's within my power, I will be happy to do for you. What could I do for you, Diogenes? Diogenes says, you know what you could do for me? You could get out of my sunshine, okay? You're blocking my light. Okay, here is the great and mighty Zeus and his symbol, the lightning bolt and the eagle. Okay, so he wanted to keep fire for himself. But Prometheus went on to Mount Olympus and he stole fire and he gave it to mankind. So he's the great hero of mankind, the savior of mankind. Oh, by the way, the Romans they loved the Greek philosophy, mythology, and stories, and they often changed the name. So Zeus became Jupiter. Okay, Hera became Juno, but they kind of jokingly made like Jupiter is a planet, of course, but Juno was this satellite that goes around it. So they named Hera as that. It's searching for Zeus. So that's a bit of a joke. And then the moons were named after lovers of Zeus because Zeus was running around, he had a bunch of mistresses. And so that's what they named the moon. So it was kind of entertaining. Okay, here's another picture of Prometheus. They had him tied to a rock, and every day the eagle would come and eat his liver. The liver is able to regenerate itself, so if they eat a little bit of liver, it can grow back. But that's quite the sound. And the gist of it being that when a man does something good, he often gets punished for it. It's just like, if you're a nutrition doctor, you're always scared. Big Pharma's going to come and do something to hurt you, or big food. Because like I said, the researchers who made discoveries that were bad for big food, like, Tyrone Hayes, he's the guy who figured out, the toxicity of atrazine and how it turned the male frogs into female frogs. They went after him. They cut his grant money. They tried to get him fired. And that's happened to lots of scientists. Seralini, the guy who figured out some of the problems with glyphosate, they did the same thing to him, tried to ruin his career. I have a friend who's a PhD molecular biologist, and he said his friend discovered that that high fructose corn syrup was routinely contaminated with mercury, so they got him fired from his job. So that's what they do. All of these things happen all the time in the modern world. People sometimes look at primitive world and say, oh, aren't they backward? They're so dogmatic. No, it's just like that in the modern world, too. One has to be careful. So here's the picture of Prometheus. So Prometheus was bound by these shackles, but actually Hercules saved them. Hercules made the risk, and he came and he shot the eagle with an arrow, and Prometheus was freed. There's a little more to the story, but that's the key point for our purposes right now. And again, the art's magnificent. This guy was a great artist, Carl Bloch, in the 1800s, and we're going to come back to him later when I show you. I'm just going to show you a whole series of paintings for Easter week, and we're just sort of building up to it by going through the ancient Greeks today. And this was St. Paul preaching in Athens at the Areopagus, painting by Raphael in 1515. And this is, the 1 Corinthians from St. Paul. If I speak in tongues of men and angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge And though I have all faith that could move mountains, but have not love, then I am nothing. Okay, so this is a big point here. This is kind of what I'm saying, that the reason why modern medicine stinks and it's a big joke is because it does not love the patient. It actually, the people who run the show, they hate the patients, okay? And so even like a school teacher wants to help the kids, but they have to work in a system that's against the interests of the kids in the public schools. And so what I'm saying is, as an individual doctor or teacher, we all do the best we can, but understanding the big picture helps us to do even better. And you need to have this appreciation and love of the individual in order to even, get reasonable results. So let's just continue. I'll finish up 1 Corinthians. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but it does rejoice with truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. For we know now in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. What I now know in part, I then shall know fully. So abide by these three, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Okay, 1 Corinthians. Okay, so what I'm showing here too is, white is the color of faith. Green is the color of hope. Red is the color of love. And those are the three colors of Christianity: faith, hope, and love. White, green, and red. And that's one of the points I'm saying. The greatest, most important part of Christianity is this idea of love and kindness, doing the right thing, love thy neighbor, all that stuff, because that's what makes life good for everybody. And as St. Paul was saying here, the love is more important than the other stuff, okay? Think about a mother's love and a father's love too. They do what's right for the kid because they love the kid no matter what, okay? And that makes things in the long run better for everybody as it ripples outward. And, the New Testament was written in Greek, okay? There's a reason for that, okay? Greek is a fundamental component of Christianity and Christian thinking. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed those art paintings, and I've got a whole bunch more paintings, art history lectures that are coming up for Easter week, and I hope you'll find them interesting and useful.